Hey everyone, Mario again, coming at you with another literature review. Today it's of a book that I read when I was in middle school, I think in 8th grade if I remember right. The book that I really did enjoy. I've read it a couple times, again over the years, and revisited it recently, since I'm on a literature kick, especially going back and forth between more modern and classic literature. And I was looking through on the shelf one day quickly, and I'm like, oh, what the heck? It, of course, is Jules Verne's classic adventure novel, Around the World in 80 Days. As you can tell from my copy, it has seen better days. I'm going to have to get a better copy one of these days, hopefully a hardcover one. But this one has served me well. This is actually the copy I got in middle school. This is not the copy we originally read, but later on I got it and reread it a couple times until this little accident. Haven't touched it in a while, but it's a very fun book. It was first published in 1873. Like I said, it's been a classic of literature. It's been turned into several films. A classic film from the 50s, which I have to say, of the three, is probably the best film. Then there was a miniseries in the 80s that had Pierce Brosnan in the Phileas Fogg role, which was a pretty decent one. It's a lot longer. It was actually about the same length, more or less, because the miniseries in the first film was made in the golden age where longer films were the norm. But I think it might be just a tad longer. And then, of course, the 104 with Jackie Chan, which is vastly different from the book, other than the main plot, which one of these days I might do a review of that, and that will probably be a rant, other than a couple little moments in the casting things. But back to the main thing. The plot of the film is that our main character is Phileas Fogg. He is a very punctual, practical man who does the same thing every day. Wakes in the morning, hangs around the house till about 11 to noon. He heads off to the Reform Club, which is a gentleman's club that mainly caters to the high class of London. Bankers, politicians, upper echelon businessmen, which of course Phileas Fogg falls in with them. Now, we don't know what he does for a living, other than we know he's rich, but it never specifies how he got his riches. Though something at the end, I'd have to say he probably inherited it. But then again, he could have had adventures previously in his life that he got the money and he's like, alright, I see no need to do anything anymore, so I'm just going to be practical now. It never states, which is one of the things that's intriguing about Fogg, is that he's like this, very practical, but you don't know a lot about him, and it's like, what is there about him? And of course, in all the mediums, it's an interesting thing, but in the book especially. As the story begins, he has hired a new servant, Passepartout. He's a Frenchman, and Passepartout has been in London for a couple of years, and he's been going from house to house trying to find the perfect place to settle into, because he's had an adventurous youth. I mean, he's been in gym troops, among other stuff, so he has some acrobatic techniques, which do come into play throughout the story, funny enough. But he just wants to have the perfect place to work, the perfect place to be a domestic servant, a butler, essentially. And when he heard about Phileas Fogg and the fact that he was looking for a butler, he's like, alright, I'll go there. Phileas Fogg hires him on the spot, gives him his list of what he has to do, and he sets off to it. Now, this day, Mr. Fogg has to pick this day to deviate from his norm, because when he's playing whist, which is a card game, at the Reform Club, they're talking about two things. One, that the Bank of England was robbed recently of over £50,000, and that a railroad in India is open, which should make circumnavigating the world a lot faster. They go back and forth arguing over how long it would take. Fogg says 80 days, and they're like, oh, 80 days under the best of circumstances. No, 80 days with everything accounted for. It goes back and forth, as Englishmen, especially in this time period, in the upper echelons, are apt to. And Fogg decides to put his money where his mouth is, and he bets £20,000 that he could make it around the world in 80 days. His men at the Reform Club agree, so the bet's on. And that night, Fogg and his new valet decide to go. And they have 80 days to make it around the world. They go from Bombay, India, to Hong Kong, to Yokohama, Japan, to San Francisco, to Utah, to New York City, back to London. And it's one adventure after another. Now, as they're going, there's this detective Fix, who is one of the many detectives that the Bank of England has sent around the world to try to find the thief. Now, he's in Calcutta when we first meet him, and he's there when Passepartout and Phileas Fogg pass through, so he thinks just from looking at Fogg and going off the description that the bank has given him, that Phileas Fogg is the thief. And so he starts following them around the world. Now, at one point, he does talk with Passepartout and say, I think your master's the one to do it. They get into a whole little thing. Not really a big argument, but Passepartout's like, no, not him. Fix says the obvious thing, like, do you really know the thing about your master? So it's at this point that Passepartout and the audience, not knowing much about Fogg's past, plays against him a little bit, because it makes you wonder, did Fogg steal it? Is that how he got his money? Is that why he tries to keep a low profile other than going to the club? And it's, in the end, we find out he didn't do it. That's one thing I'm going to spoil. He did do it. But as I was reading the book, I had a feeling he didn't do it. And, of course, the author didn't disappoint. He didn't do it. Now, Fix eventually joins Fogg's group, mainly just to get him back to London as quickly as possible. He does drug Passepartout with opium at one point, which Passepartout, it gets separated from them, but they meet up again in Japan in a very hilarious thing, which they recreated in the first film adaptation. If you've seen the film, you know what I'm talking about. The whole thing with the long noses in their gymnastics. Now, as they go around the world, they encounter a bunch of interesting characters. They save an Indian woman named Aouda from being burnt alive in India, and she joins their travels. They meet a colonel who was very rude in San Francisco during a political rally, which just leads to one of the funny little punchlines to end the chapter, when they're speculating what the rally must be over. They're saying, oh, it's probably for some politician, probably a mayor or a senator. No, sir, it's for a justice of the peace. First time I read that, I couldn't help but chuckle a lot. It's like, justice of the peace, and this is what they do? It's one of those things, if they ever did another movie version, especially if I did it, I would try to work that line in. Must be for some type of thing. No, sir, it's for justice of the peace. Just linger on the face a little bit and be like have the face not move, but you could tell just by looking at the eyes, like, okay, and then walk back on. That's basically Fogg's reaction. Looking at him, then walk back on, then walk onto the train. That's basically his reaction, but he's probably thinking, seriously? Got into a fight over justice of the peace? There's an almost duel. There's a Native American raid on the train. Passepartout is kidnapped. They have to basically pull a mutiny on a boat. There's a lot of adventures all throughout. And, of course, as you can expect, Fogg gets arrested at the end. But in the end, he makes it around the world in 80 days. And the way he accomplishes it, I'm not going to spoil, but if you know anything about going around the world and all the meridians and the international dateline and all that, you can kind of figure out what it is. And the way they pull it off in the original movie is basically the same way it's done in the book. And it works beautifully. And I just love that Fogg doesn't even realize this until it's like, wait a minute. And the way it's explained, like, oh, it worked. And of course, he doesn't really gain anything in the end, because all he does is break even in the end. Well, not really, because he does have a little bit of the money left over, which he gets split between Fix and Passepartout. Outside of the little running gag about Passepartout forgetting to turn his gas off before they left. You imagine that 80 days worth of gas going out the window? Up into the air. All because you rushed out. Now, the only thing he gains is probably a relationship, which I'm not going to go into here, but you can kind of guess it's with Aouda. Because as the book progresses, you can tell that Aouda is slowly falling in love with Mr. Fogg. He doesn't notice it, or at least doesn't seem to notice it. Passepartout notices, and he approves of it, but he doesn't think his master will go along with it. I don't know if Fix notices it. I don't remember if it mentions it. Now, I'm going to read the last couple paragraphs from it, because I really think this sums up the book nicely, or at least kind of some of its intentions, and also the whole thought of, what did Mr. Fogg really gain? There's not really many spoilers in this, other than, in fact, something I've already said, which he does gain the bet, which those of you who haven't read the book kind of might kill some of the enjoyment of the book, but it's one of those books you can tell Mr. Fogg's going to win a bet, you just don't know how, or what he's going to encounter. That's the fun of it. You know what the outcome at the end is going to be, it's just the journey getting to the destination. Thus Phileas Fogg won his bet. In 80 days he had accomplished the tour around the world. To do this he had employed every means of convenience: steamers, railways, carriages, yachts, merchant vessels, sledges, elephants. The eccentric gentleman had displayed in this affair his wonderful qualities of coolness and exactness. But what then? What had he gained by leaving home? What had he brought back from his journey? Nothing, do you say? Nothing perhaps but a charming woman who, improbable as it may appear, made him the happiest of men. Truly, would you not, for less than that, make the tour of the world? And that's a good question to ask yourself. Would you make the tour of the world for nothing less than happiness? I know I probably would if I could afford it. Probably just doing a tour around the world itself would make me happy. But then, if at the end I knew I was going to find something that brought me true happiness, I probably would do it too. And that's what Mr. Fogg gained in the end. Like you said, he really just did it to show that it could be done rather than for the financial gain, because he only got the exact amount of money that he had at the beginning of it, so the only thing that he had to lose was his money, but he had nothing to gain other than, saying, yeah, I did it. I proved the point. But he gained a wife, gained a close, devoted servant in Passepartout, an apology from Fix, and worldwide fame, but I don't really think he cared about that. So happiness, that's all he gained, and that's really the point of it, I guess you could say, is happiness. I don't know if there's really a lot to say about that outside of the context of asking yourself the question and the character, but it's there. I'll say, though, with a lot of the characters and cultures that Fogg and Passepartout encounter, it mentions some of the practices, but Verne, as a writer, he does not judge them too harshly. If there's any judgment, it's from the characters' perspectives purely, and it's not, you don't really get from his writing, his prose, that he's judging it, or that his views are coming out in the characters. Some of them could be, but there's not a lot there. It mainly has to do with the practices of the Indians when it comes to their more, for lack of a better term, barbaric practices, such as the Kali death cults, and of course what almost happened to Aouda. The Native Americans, of course, you get the typical American viewpoint, white American viewpoint, I should say, from the time that the story is set when it comes to Native Americans. But then again, they're also raiding trains, so there's that thing. But if you know anything about American history, you could see why they were raiding the trains, but it's not a little balanced thing. But it doesn't really judge it that much. It's just something that happens, and the only people saying anything about it are the characters. And of course, the fact that it puts a couple of our characters in peril, it's like, oh, I hope they get to them in time. I hope nothing bad happens to Passepartout. And of course, you get a little bit of that culture clash when Fogg and Fix walk through the American political rally, showing the difference between the British way of doing things and the American way of doing things, which the way it's described is also made a little funny by the fact that this is translated originally from French, so I can just imagine how the sentences had to be reorganized in order to conduct the translation from a Latin language, because if I remember right, French is a Latin language, to a Germanic language. Probably a little bit of shifting there, and maybe something got lost in translation, but it doesn't come off as anything missing. And then, of course, Fogg's resourcefulness, that's the only other thing left to comment on. You see it time and again. I mean, from that paragraph I read, you could see all the stuff. Steamboats, he basically bribes the pilots to push the ship faster, buying an elephant at one point. And then, of course, the whole mutiny I mentioned already. Fogg is resourceful, and that's one thing you could say is a positive, and as the story goes on, it makes you wonder even more what he did in his past, though the mutiny thing does hint that he probably was a sailor at one point. As you can tell from how much I've gone on about this book, it does come with my high recommendation. If you have not read Around the World in 80 Days, do so, especially if you are a fan of classic literature.